Right, good morning, everybody. And I'm hoping that you can see some slides. Great. Right, so yeah, just to reintroduce myself again, although I think we've probably come across each other already. So I'm Patrick Devine-Wright. I'm a professor at the University of Exeter in the Geography Department, and I'm also involved in the climate emergency process as chair of the task force, the Net Zero Task Force. So I've been given about 15 minutes to kind of recap, in a sense, some of the information that you'll have heard over the last week from the different witnesses, and yeah, maybe answer any questions that you might have to the best of my ability. So I just have a couple of slides, and I'll talk through a few points and just try and bring you back to a kind of an overview. But I think it's worth starting with this pie chart because it just brings us back to what's the energy that's used at the moment, more or less 2018. And this is information that was provided by Tony Norton, Dr. Tony Norton, last Wednesday. And basically, petroleum products in orange, 46%, gas in grey, 29%. So you add them together and you've got some coal being used. So basically, you've got nearly 80%, 75% of the energy used in Devon in 2018 came from fossil fuels. And those fossil fuels are leading to the emission of greenhouse gases and are what is causing climate change. So you can actually see that the scale of the change required in order to completely the challenge is to completely remove those fuels from our energy system. No more coal, no more gas, no more oil. And that means big changes in how we generate our electricity, how we heat our homes and buildings, and how we move around in our cars, in our trucks, in our vans, etc. So that's the scale of the change needed. We need to completely transform this picture. And even in terms of electricity, so only about 1/5 of the electricity in 2018 that was used in Devon came from renewable energy. So that means that virtually 80% of it came from fossil fuels, and much of that was gas. So all of that needs to change, and it needs to change fast in order to deal with the climate emergency. So that's the kind of big picture challenge, but it's not easy to change energy systems. The technologies can be in place for decades, and it costs a lot of money, a lot of investment, and there's some risk attached with that. So these are some of the points. Sorry, there's quite a lot of info on this slide. But basically what Tony was saying was that we need a lot more electricity in the future because we want to use less gas and we want to use less petrol in our cars and less diesel in our vans and buses, etc. So we need more electricity. So where are we going to get that electricity from? To deal with the climate emergency, we need to get it from renewable sources. And we found out that actually those renewable sources are cheaper than gas and cheaper than nuclear, cheaper than other sources for generating electricity. So in some senses, that's good news. We also found that from a Devon point of view, large-scale solar had the highest potential in the sense that we have the kind of climate here, which is suitable for large-scale solar PV. But it's also, there's some significant potential for onshore wind as well. And despite the relatively low cost of onshore wind, development has really stalled in the last 5 years, mainly down to national policy, but also concerns about financial risk taken by companies. So even though the resource is there, even though the cost is low, it's not been happening. And that's been a problem to date. In terms of the economics of onshore wind, as mentioned, it's one of the cheaper sources. There is potential to employ a considerable number of people, potentially up to 15,000 across the UK by 2035, depending on national policy to some degree. But it's also the case that in terms of specifically looking at jobs created, the building retrofit area is really where there could be some significant positive changes in terms of lots of people being needed in order to make those changes to the fabric of buildings. But if you think about onshore wind from an economic point of view, it's not just about how many jobs are created or how much onshore wind energy costs, because a lot of companies now and a lot of universities and institutions want to go to net zero. They want to use green electricity. So if that green energy or renewable energy is not available, they can't do that. But similarly, if it is available, it'll attract companies who want to have that kind of energy possibility. So a country and a county that has a lot of renewable energy available will be able to attract these companies that want to be able to say to their customers or their clients, yes, we're using that kind of electricity, which is good for the planet, etc. And there's also estimates that the cost of electricity will go down in the future if we use more renewable energy in comparison to if we continue to use fossil fuel sources. So lots of positives there on the economic side. In terms of the socioeconomics, Professor Ian Bailey of Plymouth University took us on a little tour of what has happened in Cornwall. And it's really instructive to see the differences between what happened in Cornwall and what's been happening in Devon. Because although the amount of onshore wind is roughly the same in each county, the way it's happened has been completely different. And basically in Cornwall, they've had a large number of very small projects, maybe a single turbine put up by a farmer on their own land. Whereas in Devon, we've had a smaller number of large wind farm projects put together by private companies or developers. It's the same number, same amount of electricity produced, but in a very different way. Now that has a lot of additional implications in terms of the landscape is different because you get in Cornwall lots and lots and lots of small turbines, whereas in Devon, you've got a relatively small cluster of large turbines, which has a difference across the landscape as a whole. But also it has socioeconomic implications because the distribution of the gains, the financial gains, will be broader, I suppose, across the community in Cornwall rather than in Devon, where it'll be more concentrated in certain areas or even flowing out of the county if the company is ultimately owned by investors elsewhere. And Ian gave us some of the reasons why he thought that that pattern was different and was quite critical of policy locally and nationally arising from it. We've also heard about the landscape aspects and recognized that landscape is an area perceived to be in a certain way from the interaction of people and natural factors, wildlife, etc. And the fact that Devon has these very constrained areas due to national parks, areas of outstanding natural beauty where you may not want to put large-scale energy infrastructure. And Alex also introduced us to one particular case study which was granted consent ultimately after a long period of time and lots of appeals, and there were large numbers of letters of objection plus some letters of support as well, many of which were complaining or contesting whether it was going to be good or positive for the landscape. But of course, it's worth remembering that landscapes will change with climate change anyway. They won't stay the same over the next few decades with warming and changing weather patterns. So just to finish, we also have been hearing about wildlife and ecology. And of course, climate change is a threat to biodiversity. So the challenge then is how to develop renewables and onshore wind in a way that doesn't threaten biodiversity too. There are particular concerns around birds, avian species, bats, and it comes down to the careful siting, careful assessment, thinking about where turbines go, what direction they face, and where birds are oriented in that area. Also about the surface of where a wind farm is built, what kind of habitat is there, what kind of species live there, how solid that foundation is, etc. And thinking very, very carefully about that at the assessment stage. And then finally, we heard about some community benefits that arise when companies take forward wind farms. And in this particular Fullerbrook wind farm case study that you heard about, over nearly £1.5 million was distributed to local community groups in the course of 4 or 5 years. So quite a significant resource going to charities, community groups, action groups. And the thing about it was that the decision-making body is a local one with a community interest company made out of people who live in that local area, and they make the decisions on where the money should go. And that provided some very important assistance to groups during the COVID pandemic. So there are economic consequences and benefits after wind farms are constructed that are not just about employment opportunities, but it's where the distribution of community benefit funds tend to go. And onshore wind is usually associated with these kind of community benefit funds, and more so than in the case of large-scale solar PV, where it's less common that the developers of those large-scale projects distribute community benefit funds. Okay, that's my whistle-stop tour. I hope that wasn't too much fine detail, but it's a bit of an overview, I think, and hopefully a summary of some of the more important points that you would have heard across the last week. And starting with that bigger picture at the beginning of the fact that we really are still in our energy system, mainly 70–80% using fossil fuels, and all that needs to change in the next couple of decades. Thank you.